Media Podcast. Today our guest is Gustav Gressel. He's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he focuses on topics of defense and security in Central Europe. Welcome, Gustav.
Welcome. Thanks for having me back.
We have talked to you half a year ago on the outcome of the Russia's war of invasion in Ukraine against Ukraine, and now we are facing 2 years of this full-scale invasion and 10 years of Russia's war against Ukraine. What are the main lessons we have learned or have not learned yet?
Well, there are so many, but especially looking back into the 10-year war, first and foremost lessons is that you go to war with the army you have, not the army your white book talks about. And this has been true for both sides now. Ukrainians were in a dismal state militarily in 2014 that allowed Russia to easily gain ground. And Russia has watered down and butchered its defense reforms or the defense reform attempts, and that made it very difficult in 2022 to do what they actually thought they were able to do. On the other side, also on the Ukrainian side, Ukraine had, I think in 2021, they had a very good concept for how to develop the army forward and what to do, and it pointed all in the right directions, from reserve forces to air force modernization. If you look at the old papers, if that all sort of would have been achieved, it would be a cool army that would be capable of fighting this war. But of course, then the war came before that was realized, and you had to fight with the army you had. The difficulties that your territorial defense forces were only very recently actually formed, and a lot of stuff was a lot of formations were new, and then of course you had to scale it, had to mobilize a lot of reserve officers. You couldn't send to reserve officer training before the war because there wasn't a time. All of this that was planned basically was preempted by the outbreak, and this is sometimes when I see like our ministries of defense, they also like to plan very much ahead and then develop concepts for armed forces that should come into being if finance ministers would give them actually money for it. But at the end, look at Ukraine, you very much need to fight with the armies that you just have.
But when we talk about the full-scale invasion, not the time before it, 2014, 2021, this time of creation of the new Ukrainian army, but the time of full-scale fighting on the territory from Kiev Oblast to Zaporizhia Oblast. What can we say? How was the development? Was it one singular, one more or less homogeneous campaign?
No, we are actually now through several different phases of the war as such, and the war has quite changed in character. I once talked to a Ukrainian soldier who spent 1 year in captivity in Russia and was exchanged recently, and he said that the war I was taken prisoner from is a totally different war than the war I returned to, because the Russian army has changed, the use of drones has changed, the electronic warfare posture has changed, the mobility has changed. At the beginning it was a very mobile war, now it's a more static war. The application of firepower of tanks has changed, etc. So we had a very, very mobile maneuver war at the very beginning. Russia basically tried to use this multi-pronged attack as much as it can to gain territory at the expense of their ability to control territory, at the expense of their ability to run logistics to the forward troops, at the expense of properly reconnoitering where they actually are and where Ukrainian forces are, just basically to be quick, as sort of to prioritize speed above all. That's actually not something new. That's, if you carefully read Soviet doctrines and manuals from the Cold War, it's an element of Russian military thinking to emphasize, or Soviet military thinking to emphasize speed above all.
Was it because they wanted to gain like a political control of a Kiev, first of all?
Yes, because they underestimated the resistance that people would put up against an occupier. They underestimate certainly the resistance Ukrainians will put up, and they want to achieve results very quickly. Also, if you read Russian military literature at the beginning of the war, there are a lot of talk about strategic surprise, operative surprise, the need to create fact on the ground as long as the enemy is stunned and doesn't know or has sort of the disadvantage that he has to react and is not yet fully prepared. That of course failed for various reasons, and then we entered a war of attrition. So Russia, and that is something that is confused very often. People think, yeah, but then they only wanted to liberate, quote unquote, the Donbass. No, they sort of regrouped their military operations to a territory that they, and to a length of front they can serve with the armed forces they have. The problem is, before that, the armed forces were overextended. They couldn't concentrate properly because they were covering so large areas and a so large front that basically the elements there of the armed forces got lost in the large country, and they could be engaged and beaten in isolated groups. And that, of course, is not possible in the Donbass and in sort of the front line we have now, because there is, first of all, compared to March, April 2022, now the Russian armed forces in Ukraine are roughly twice as large as then. And back then they started with roughly 190,000 troops, out of which a considerable part was actually National Guard, so paramilitary, not really suited for infantry, for fighting tasks, only suited for repression and occupation regime and prosecution of opposition, etc. Now there are roughly 410,000 soldiers present on the on Ukrainian soil, and they're all soldiers.
But that means that the Russians have twice as much troops on more or less twice as less territory.
Yes,
they control
yes,
early 2020.
yes, and this is why the force concentration is much denser. So while, for example, all these maneuvers, Ukraine could fall into the flank of Russian forces, get into the rear, beat them in isolation. That is something you can do if there is a low force concentration, if there are few soldiers on large territory. Now we have a lot of soldiers on a smaller territory, and that of course restricts your ability to maneuver around, to exploit gaps, because there aren't any. And of course it allows Russia to concentrate forces and to hammer forward these offenses they're doing now. But also the war of attrition has seen a lot of phases. At first we saw basically classical Soviet large-scale application of artillery fire combined with large infantry and mechanized assaults. That was successful in May, June 2022 to some extent. They could not achieve breakthroughs that were large enough to be of operative significance, but tactical significance, they achieved breakthroughs. And it was very hard for Ukrainians, given the lack of armored vehicles, to really defend against such a huge volume of firepower. It's estimated in 2022 alone that the Russian army fired roughly 12 million shells of artillery. That is a huge quantity. That, of course, changed because Ukrainians adapted how to defend against such large volumes, because the amount of armored vehicles in Ukrainian service increased. Also, and especially in the winter offensive, Ukraine used drones, small group tactics, indirect firepower by first-person view drones to really spoil these kind of assaults. At the same time, Russia could not keep up with the artillery shell supply to just keep on fighting like the USSR. Even with North Korean and Iranian help, they had to economize. And that's basically what really came into effect in what was tried out by Wagner. Wagner, in many ways, was a tactical, doctrinal laboratory, how to fight more efficiently, how to fight in smaller units, how to do this kind of street fighting stuff, not like the USSR, but more like a modern army. And then, of course, defending against the counter-offensive, a lot of these new Russian tactics, new Russian electronic warfare, not means, not systems, but how to use them, kind of electronic warfare doctrine, if I can say so, were actually applied quite effectively. And now we have a situation where both parties try to refine their tactics to make use of new technologies of drones. The Russians are now unfortunately outproducing Ukrainians in drones. Russians are increasingly moving to small tactics, not these kind of Soviet type assaults, but also refining their assault tactics and trying to get better. They're increasingly using the Air Force, which is to me very worrying, because the Russian Air Force in the air-to-ground role was quite underused for the last 2 years. And they tried to make use of the weakness in Ukrainian supply with air defense missiles. And yeah, so we'll see. I think 2024, we will see Ukraine mainly on the defense, trying to retreat Russian forces, try to induce material losses, first of all, and experimenting with new tactics, experimenting with new stuff, and depending on the political situation in the West, and trying to tilt the favors of the war in 2025 or 26.
That are a lot of topics you have mentioned already. The whole new experience which both armies have gained and partly adopted. We're talking to Gustav Gressel, who is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, focusing on the topics of defense and security in Central Europe and, of course, Russia-Ukrainian war. Before we go further to the questions of what is to be expected in this war, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and leave your ideas and commentaries under this video. We know that the Ukrainians tried to start an offensive in the year 2023 to the south towards the Sea of Azov. This offensive was not as successful as one expected because of many reasons. But now the objective, the goal remains the same. The Ukrainians need to come to the Sea of Azov to cut this land corridor to Crimea. And they face massive minefields, and they face Russian drones and Russian artillery. How can these obstacles be defeated? And what are the lessons of the failed march to the Sea of Azov from the year 2023?
Well, the first lesson was that the new formed and new assembled Ukrainian brigades were not yet ready for the job when they were there. A brigade, in order to function as an entire brigade, it needs time for people to get accustomed to each other. You can compare that with football national teams. You have the sports clubs, and then you send football players to a national team. And if these national teams have insufficient time to train together and to get used together and have training games together, they lose even if they have good players in their ranks, because the team play is not at the status of where it should be. And now a brigade is roughly a football team with 4,000 players or 3,000 players. So imagine how much you need to train and to get accustomed to each other, to be at the peak level of effectiveness with what you have. Now, the problem is that, for example, a lot of old Ukrainian brigades, they have, of course, this cohesion, and a lot of them gain cohesion during defensive operations, which are easier to conduct than offensive operations. And this was sort of the highest demand for any kind of military units, it's enormously difficult to penetrate these defenses. And hence, of course, the training issue came out. The training issue was compiled that so you had new brigades, and the new brigades had new equipment that, of course, was technically good, but people also need a bit of experience with them to see the strength and the weaknesses of each of them, and logistically, preparationally get experience with them. So that is one. The second thing is that for any new assault, the mix, the table of organization, so the mix of what kind of troops you have will be different. The second thing is the kind of which kind of drone, which kind of electronic warfare capability you need at what level. So what is the kind of drone level a company commander, a battalion commander really needs? Where can he rest on information provided by others, etc.? How to coordinate that? That is all undergoing experimentation. It's a new technology. It's provides new things to commanders, and they also refine the sort of where does it distract me? Where does it really provide helpful stuff? How can I make better use of that? There's a lot of experience in Ukraine using these things for defense, but there was much less experience and knowledge about how to use that on the offense, and they require different roles and different mix of forces. So how to overcome strong defenses? So the first thing is, of course, Ukrainians are refining their tactics and the tables of organization. What a mechanized brigade that assaults into such a heavy fortified area will look like. How many drones they need at what level, who shall command it, what kind of information, what kind of new capabilities, electronic warfare drones, each commander, company, battalion, etc. need. That's the first thing. The second thing is they're, of course, testing jammers to keep away Russian drones. They're testing modernizing some air defense means, self-propelled guns, etc., to have a better capability to protect assault forces in such an endeavor. They're testing new creative means to locate and to destroy mines. There will be a much higher ratio of combat engineers in the overall mix attacking, because you need more capabilities to clear mines, you need more capabilities to clear obstacles, you need a sort of a higher amount of facilitators to facilitate movements. Of course, most of the stuff, what kind of new stuff you need to clear mines, that is classified and nobody really openly talks about it, but they're experimenting with different kinds of systems. And I mean, the Russians do as well. Ukrainian minefields are equally effective, and Avdiivka, Vuhledar are perfect examples of how Russia has the same problems, that overcoming well-defended minefields is a problem. Then, of course, the issue is shaping and fire superiority. You need a lot of shells to suppress enemy positions, to reduce their capacity to defend minefields, because at the end, all the technical obstacles, we can be fascinated by it, but they're only as good as the troops defending them, because a mine can be cleared by an engineer, and if that engineer is unmolested, nobody shoots at them, then the engineer will just clear the mine. It's not a big deal. But of course, if people shoot at the engineers, if there's constant artillery fire, etc., then of course mine clearing, then the minefield becomes a real obstacle. If there are combat helicopters that or just wait for the mine clearing tanks and snipe them out, etc. So these things, first of all, Ukrainians know they need a higher concentration of fires on the Russian lines to really do the harm that needs to be done. And they need a higher concentration of fires in the rear. That was one of the big problems of this offensive, that the Russians still moved freely reserves into battle and could counter Ukrainian breaches by throwing in reserves. And they were not hit by sufficiently and destroyed by fires before they reached the battlefield, which is called interdiction. Usually, NATO does this with combat, with attack helicopters, with Apaches, and with aircraft, A-10s, F-16s, etc. Now the problem, because of the heavy SAM, surface-to-air missile density on the Russian lines, it is very unlikely that the Ukrainians will use combat helicopters and fighters on their own. They might use some standoff weapons. They had hoped that they would do that with artillery and long-range artillery, like Vulcan shells for 155 millimeter, like HIMARS rockets. But these reserves were very well protected from the Russian side with jammers to spoof GPS, etc. And the effect on these reserves by fires was not as high as Ukrainians had hoped for, and that sort of led the Russians continue to fight actively in the defense. So Ukrainians will give a thought about how to address this. Use different kind of ammunition, use more artillery. We will see what the West delivers. I think it was a crucial mistake not to deliver cluster munition, ATACMS and HIMARS rockets for the counteroffensive, because those rockets, they don't need to be jammed. They're unguided, and they rest on the cluster effect, so they're much more resilient against electronic warfare, and they have a very good area effect. You don't need to hit every tank individually. The cluster munition spread, and they can hit the column that is on the way to engage the Ukrainians, etc. So these mines are perfectly suited for that. They use some German scatterable mines. I hope the Germans still have some of them, because they're also good at doing that. They hold up reserves. If you throw this is our rocket launcher that throws mines, and if you see that the Russian column is approaching via this road, moving towards the point where Ukrainians breach in, and you throw the mines in the way, then they're bothered. They of course clear these mines, but it takes time. And if you have the corresponding cluster munition, then while they wait, they get a visitor. So this kind of stuff, they know that they need much higher quantities of fire to breach a defense, and that basically a lot of tinkering. The thing is, sometimes even small variations can mount up to really decisive results. And during the counteroffensive, there were certain situations where especially the 82nd Brigade was really on the verge of achieving the breakthrough everybody hoped through, but ultimately Russians could very narrowly tilt the battles and the fight. If you improve even marginally on a lot of factors, or if they had improved even marginally in a lot of factors, probably that, because if things are on the nice edge, it's sometimes not much that tips it over. And now Ukrainians of course look very deep into what happens, how this happens, and how to regain that. They will improve a lot of factors, but on the other hand, said that till they have the material, sort of necessary artillery and rocket artillery ammunition to actually conduct such an offensive, till they have the combat engineering capabilities to breach that, we are in 2025.
That is what you said during our last interview in summer, when you said that trying to micromanage the war leads to a defeat. You cannot micromanage the war. You need to give as much weapons and ammunition as possible to create a significant potential for offensive. Does the West still try to micromanage this war, or something even worse has happened with the stop of supply of certain types of weapons?
I think it was a bit of a lesson, but the problem is now, of course, especially in the US, and US is very crucial for a lot of ammunitions and details, that of course now the domestic squabbles take over, which is very unfortunate. When I was in Washington in April, and there were a lot of people that thought that that were afraid of Ukrainian victory, that it was so decisive that it would tilt Russia over the nuclear threshold, and at the end, this kind of fear led let people to hesitate in supply, and then you don't have reserve. You don't have reserve in firepower. You don't have reserves in equipment that you can throw into the battle if things don't go so well. And bad things happen in war. It never goes according to plan. I hope these lessons are taken in, but of course now they are of course watered down by political squabbles. The other thing, saying sort of why does our political will, is the political clarity there that this is a long war, that Ukraine needs to be supported over the long war, and there is no shortcut to this war. I think that lesson is still not entirely learned. If you look how there were some Reuters reports that Russia wants to have a ceasefire, etc. That is, of course, in substance, is all fake news. But if you look at how people react in the West to that, there is still a lot of wishful thinking out there. Like wishful thinking, yeah, shouldn't the Russians be exhausted and shouldn't they agree for a ceasefire? So if I step back now from the tactical situation to the strategic situation, and this is something that not Putin invented last year, but even if you look at the first foreign policy program of when Putin was still prime minister, he gave the goal that, Russia needs to modernize militarily, economically, financially in order to stop the decline. Then it needs to reintegrate the post-Soviet space, and that makes Russia a great power. This is a continuum. This is not something he invented, because he was insulted at conference X, Y, Z, or because of Bucharest or whatever. This is like what he always said and done. For him, conquering Ukraine, forcing it back into the empire, is a precondition of becoming great power. If Putin if Putin says, okay, I'm happy with 20% of the country, he also would seize his lifetime aim of re-establishing Russia as a great power. And he's not ready for that. So why he talks of ceasefires? Because he knows that there are two different mindsets on diplomacy. You have the Russian mindset and the Western mindset. And the Russian mindset is very much sort of what Milosevic did in the Balkan Wars. He engaged in negotiations to keep the West busy, to keep the West believing that a ceasefire might be around the corner, that Serbia might agree to the Owen-Stoltenberg plan or the Vance-Owen plan, or how many UN resolutions on a ceasefire and on the negotiations were spent in the UN Security Council. Just look it up. It's crazy. It's entirely crazy. But these were all fake negotiations to postpone military intervention of NATO, to keep the indiscriminate arms embargo on the entirety of Yugoslavia, which, because Serbia got, of course, weapons from Russia, was a one-sided embargo against the Croats and the Bosniaks. And the same thing is now. Yes, the Russians want to negotiate, not with Ukrainians, but with the West. And they want to tell them things that make the West believe that there is a ceasefire in the possible reach. And this comfort should delay the West producing new weapon systems, delivering new categories of weapon systems, because you don't want to endanger the negotiation process and have this illusion that the war will end soon, because Russian war economy is running at full speed. European and American economy is by and large still in peacetime. And if you prolong that state, that gives Russia an advantage in the war of attrition. And this basically has they still believe in a shortcut, in a ceasefire. That is the new micromanagement, the kind of political disalignment with the reality that keeps people from committing more resources to the war. And we see now everybody talks about artillery shell shortages. The problem was, of course, both Americans and Europeans were late in increasing production. The Americans were, of course, the first to really throw money at the problem, but industry takes time. If you order, factories build new machinery, learn new people, all that takes time. But artillery ammunition is also the simplest defense good. we have. Fabricating an artillery shot, so the shell, the fuse, and the propellant charge takes 6 to 9 months, depending on what the chemical pre-products are like. And it's more about sort of the time shuttle is not casting the shell and filling it with but the production of the explosives. That is what takes time, because the chemical processes of stabilizing, especially the propellant charges, takes time. But it's fairly short. You can react to demand fairly quickly. You can order stuff, and in 6 months you have it. If you order a Leopard 2 tank, you wait 3 years. If you order an average infantry fighting vehicle, you wait roughly 2 years. If you order a CSAR, you wait 1 year for it being delivered from the order. And the more complex defense goods become, the more issues you have in the supply chain. You have much more subcontractors. And they all need, if they increase production, they need to have stable long-term demand, because they're all private enterprises in the West. We're not talking about the Rostec, where the money comes from the state anyway, and nobody cares. These are all private enterprises. And now we have the artillery gap shortages, but Ukraine loses a staggering amount of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles. And where do we replace them? We first replace them by Polish, Czech, Bulgarian equipment that was left over from transition to NATO standards. This basically pool is roughly expired. Yes, there are still some few T-72s that are worthy of restoring. But if you look at how many are in the pipeline for being restored, the pipeline is a fifth of what it was 1.5 years ago, because we don't have the hulls that are really, that you can repair, even if you throw the money at it. And the second thing is with T-72 is the ammunition problem. But let's not run into details. Now, of course, we refurbish a lot of Cold War stuff that is still left over. Leopard 1s. It's not a bad tank. But it's also not a tank in production. And if we will supply Ukraine this year still with a handful of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles that are renovated, that are refurbished from Cold War stocks. That's all good. But what are we going to do next year when these are expired? If we start to order then new tanks because we see, oops, we still need to replace losses, then we wait 3 years for the replacement. And then you start to get into the discussion between armed forces who say, well, we also have NATO duties, we can't give Ukraine everything. Nervous publics, Trump might be president and nobody knows for sure the future of NATO and whatever. So we might have a high reluctance of Europeans to give donations, to give equipment. We have, at the same time, long production lines and a shortage because of the losses of the war thus far. That's exactly what Putin is trying to achieve, and that's why he does this, I would call it not negotiations, but psychological warfare, to make people, publics, opinion leaders believe that there is a shortcut to the war effort. It doesn't have to be that expensive. It doesn't have to be about a lot of tanks. We just can negotiate, and that is the new danger I fear. I think if we stop, we have to a certain point stop micromanaging. But if we commit resources, if we go up with our own production defense industry, the West still, our financial resources are considerably higher than Russians. Our innovative potential, the quality of Western manufacturing, Ukrainian soldiers appreciate it. If you listen to feedback from the people that use our weapon systems, the stuff is good. And Ukrainians can use it. Yes, they need time for training, and yes, they need time to get accustomed to it, how to use it in combat and how not to use it in combat. That's a natural thing, but it works. It bloody works if you look at how they use Marders and Bradleys and Leopards.
Indeed, we have seen during the battle for Avdiivka, we have seen how the Ukrainian Bradleys destroyed, even in one-to-one combat, Russian heavy tanks. and that
Yeah.
was very impressive to
Yeah.
witness. But what we have as an area where the West doesn't micromanage much and where Ukrainians have got a lot of success is the maritime warfare. The Ukrainian Navy and the Ukrainian the Ukrainian SBU and GUR Military Intelligence Directorate, using naval drones, have practically forced the Russian Navy to move to the eastern harbors of the Black Sea to Novorossiysk, having destroyed 30% of the Russian Black Sea Navy, not having any single naval vessel which Ukraine could use against the Russian Navy. No, was done solely by naval drones, and in the first time of war by missiles, as the hit of the Moskva cruiser, but recently mostly drones. Is it a new area of warfare which the West still has to understand and to learn?
Yes, and it's something we should take particularly notice because it's a pioneering thing to re-establish capabilities that actually were lost by navies, and that is a kind of what the jeune école, the new school of French military thinking, called the cruiser war. Because it's sort of, first, yes, you mentioned the Russian Navy, but Ukrainian has also struck oil facilities and ships in Novorossiysk port, which before the war was the most important oil exporting port of the Russian Federation. They made it basically impossible because these oil tankers also need to be insured. And Western sanctions prevent Western insurances, but even that, if other Chinese insurance companies jump in. Now, of course, if you go to the port of Novorossiysk, which is at the threat, even if the Ukrainians strike only occasionally, but it's at the threat of such a strike, the insurance amount, the fees have skyrocketed, and you sort of cutting into the profit of Russia. And this is a remarkable, also a remarkable development because, for example, we will, in naval warfare generally, we saw this cruiser warfare against the maritime economy and navy basically all over centuries. But the thing is that modern navies with for example, modern submarines or modern frigates, these items are so expensive and so complex and so scarce because they're so complex that you do not use them for commerce-raiding and for interdiction of supply lines anymore, because you can't afford to send them all over the place, and you don't have so many platforms to cover even a littoral sea as such. The German Navy that built 1,500 submarines during Second World War now operates 6 submarines. They're of course much better and highly specialized, but they're just 6 submarines. And if you assume that you have 1/3 in the yard and 1/3 of your submarine force commuting to and from the station areas, a 6 submarine force means that you have 2 submarines on station. And 2 submarines is not a blockade, and it's not a commerce raiding force. But these drones are, and you can produce them in mass. A submarine can be built by a highly specialized naval yacht. If your yard produces civilian craft, they have no idea of how to produce a submarine. It's impossible. The components that go into a submarine or submarine armament, like torpedoes, they're regulated, they're expensive, etc. Naval drones can be produced by everybody who produces sport boats. You can use a much larger quantity of your civilian economy for the war effort, because basically it's a radio-controlled sport boats with an explosive. So you can make use of components you easier get. You can substitute. If you don't get engine A, you can get engine B, and it will drive it. This makes it much more resilient to produce these things. It makes it easier to scale up production. Now we talk again about numbers that really matter, that really worry not only the Russian Navy, but also the Russian merchant fleet. You can really box them away. And that is something to be noticed, because people will, like centuries and centuries in naval warfare, feel the need for commerce riding ever again. If there is a war between the Americans and the Chinese, you will certainly see that both parties will very soon employ such kind of naval drones, because they need the capabilities, and they can't do that by highly expensive specialized submarines. The same is in the air war. During World War II, the Americans built tens of thousands of four-engine bombers to go after power stations, train stations, supply hubs, whatever. You can't afford sending a strategic bomber after the same targets, but drones are sent. And they fill a lot of this strategic bombing role that the bombers, the four-engine bombers, were there in World War II, because you have a need to cripple the enemy's war economy. Russia's attacks against Ukrainian electricity grid and grain infrastructure are the most commonly known one, but Ukrainians are also catching up on this, and they are destroying refineries, they're destroying gas production stations, they're also targeting chemical plants that work in the production of powder. I would very much love to have Europeans support and second this drone effort, because it is very important to also making use of the fact that the Russian war economy is a legitimate military target, versus the Western defense economy is in the West, and this basically gives us a competitive advantage over Russia. But of course, it would require the West to have the balls to say, well, Ukraine is under international law fully free to attack targets in Russia, and here are the means to do so. Have fun with it. Because the Russian war economy should be crippled, and Russian air defense assets should be dispersed across all Russia for the fear of deep strikes and attacks, in order to decrease the density of these means in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we still are afraid of escalation. As fortunately, only few governments have made the rationale. Yeah, I hope for a change of mind in the West on this regard.
That is exactly the perspective which the Western countries and governments need to digest still 2 years after the start of the full-scale invasion. There is not yet the full understanding of the gravity of the case. We are talking to Gustav Gressel, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, focusing on the topics of Central Europe and in particular Russo-Ukrainian war. And what are the perspectives for the campaign 2024? And has the year 2024 a chance to be the last year of this war?
On the end of the war, I don't think so. So and this is also something that is misportrayed in the West. A lot of people ask me, well, now that the counteroffensive was not successful, will Zelensky seek a ceasefire? And like, guys, you know, Zelensky didn't start the war, and it's not his private hobby. It's not like you go in a football club and if you don't like the game, you quit and you play tennis. Russia started the war. Russia has war aims beyond Ukraine, but they think that subjugating entire Ukraine is an important means to that. And until they have expired all means to achieve their war aims, they will not go for a ceasefire. They might go for a ceasefire if they feel the need to have a pause to rearm, the earliest, but that given the stocks of Russian equipment and people killed are not the critical resources Putin pays attention to. It's equipment destroyed that they can hardly replace. At the current level of attrition, I see 2026 as the earliest date that Russia will have material shortages. For this year, I don't think so. The first of all is Western supply problems that we all see. This situation will get better by the end of this year. European production will increase. American production is also set to increase if Biden gets his package through. Just as a reminder, in that package, there are also a lot of subsidies for US defense enterprises to increase production. It's not only shells for Ukraine, it's also subsidies for the own arms industry. And that Republicans block subsidies for their own defense industry, that is something, you know, I had not in my bingo card. But okay, leave that aside. The second thing is mobilization. Ukrainian troops are, especially the mechanized elite forces that have been at the center of every big battle until now, they're exhausted. But the problem is rotating forces it looks easy. When you look at the numbers, you can say, well, there are so many troops guarding the Belarusian border. Can't you rotate them in and pull the poor guys who are fighting around Avdiivka and other hotspots now out? The problem is that these forces have very different capabilities. On the Belarusian border, you have by and large light infantry. If you send light infantry into such contested spaces like Avdiivka without armored transport, without long-range artillery, all the stuff that light territorial forces don't have, you're basically committing, it's slaughter. They don't stand the chance to withstand these fights there. They are guarding and they're defending fixed obstacles, minefields in wooden hill areas where you can't drive by tanks, etc. They are suited for this. But they're not suited to fight like Vuhledar, where you have very sort of level plain, open fields, and a lot of tanks and huge amounts of artillery. So in order to rotate forces, you need also to have the equipment to do so, to create sort of alternative mechanized forces, throw them in, rotate them out. And you need a constant flow of people into the established forces, because there they can sort of, learning by doing, train themselves up. That depends on Western supplies. There will come more this year, but I would still wish it were more. And the second thing is mobilization and sort of amendments to the mobilization law in Ukraine that will allow for more soldiers, because then it's much easier to rotate forces. Once you rotate forces, you can start to retrain them, because, as said in the initial part, Ukrainians are trying out new systems. They're trying out new tactics. They're trying out new mixes, how to mix forces, what's the appropriate level of here and there. You have to try that out, and you have to train these people together before you send them into combat to apply that. And that takes time. Now, if we factor all this together, mobilization needs to be executed first, and then you have some pullouts of some brigades, reformation, retraining. We are in 2025. If you do that properly, it takes time. It's there are no overnight miracles in the military, and that's also why Syrskyi said, well, we will stay on the defensive posture. We will increase our fortifications, and we'll let the Russians bleed, because of course he needs time for all these measures. And the best way to use that is to let the Russians assault and bleed till they are depleted of equipment, and they have their own troops exhausted, because it's so much more difficult to mount an offense than to be in a defense, and much more exhausting. Then let the Russians come until they are weak again, and once they're weak and we are trained and we have done our preparations and the West has done his delivery duties, then of course you can strike. But I don't think 2024 is a year where that materialized. However, I would love to be positively surprised, but then it's probably going to be if the Russians really screw up in some sectors of the front, leave something unprotected, have a colossal failure with one of the units that Ukrainians can exploit. This would be a kind of opportunistic offensive that could still happen. However, I would not make war plans on the prospect that you might be lucky. War plans should be made on, forces, structures, material, and certainty, and large margins of reserves that you can use if things don't go well and don't go according to plan, and that you still have something to throw at the problem.
Looking into this 2 years perspective you have pictured now, can we expect that Russia will try to start a sort of a hybrid attack or challenging Western allies with more or less military pressure during this year, while Ukraine is dependent on what weapons the NATO allies will provide for Ukraine?
So hybrid or psychological warfare, they will start. They are actually already doing that. Confusion, propaganda, psychological warfare. On kinetic assaults, I am highly skeptic. The Russian army is bogged down in Ukraine. And this is really something Europeans need to understand. As long as this armed force is bogged down in Ukraine, they do not have the resources and the ammunition to start another war. So if Putin does something, he needs to be very certain that there is no larger reaction from the West. For the time being, that's why he does not engage in larger provocations. If we were more assertive, for example, shooting down rockets and drones that come close to NATO airspace and not treat like every cruise missile that accidentally goes into Polish airspace, sometimes intentionally uses the Polish airspace or the Romanian airspace or the Moldovan airspace to strike targets in Ukraine. If you're not afraid of that, of shooting them down, and tell the Russians to, like Turkey did in 2015, to never ever try this again, it would be good, because that shows a certain assertiveness. And just look at Erdogan. After the shootdown, Putin respected Erdogan because he showed him, no, I'm not going to be bullied with. That would be good, because that would also increase our security. It would show the Russians don't do that. The big question mark, of course, will what happens if Donald Trump is elected, because a lot of things can happen. Then Russia could grow more assertive, but still, as long as the conventional war in Ukraine is going on, they cannot afford a large-scale war with NATO, even reminiscent European states. They have moved so many air defense assets into Ukraine, they can't protect their facilities, their strategic infrastructure in the rear. Even with relatively cheap Ukrainian drones, you can hit. If the French, the British, and the Germans would use their sophisticated cruise missiles to go down over the Russian economy and strategic infrastructure with that low level of protection, you can roughly imagine what that would entail. So we're not talking. We would be in a scenario where Russia has a very few good options but to threaten nuclear escalation, and then we would immediately be in a nuclear escalation threat game, which can also go wrong for Russia. And Putin is a cynical, power-hungry dictator, but he's not a madman. He carefully weighs his options, and he strikes predominantly at victims, at people he thinks are weak, who are not decisive, who don't have resources to react, and who are easy targets. He thought Ukraine would be an easy target. He listened to his pals that told him the society is split and Zelensky is unpopular, so let's go for it. But he did not go for Ukraine because it was strong, or it appeared strong. That was his miscalculation. And the same thing is with the West. We are much stronger. And if we also show him that we will not be just a victim, we can solve that. But of course, the long-term threat depends on how this war ends. If the war ends with a Russian victory, if in the case of Trump, Europeans will create the conditions for the Russian victory, because for the fear of Russia stopping to supply Ukraine, thinking that my army first and then Ukrainians, because now with crazy Trump, we can't afford to supply them, then of course we might create self-fulfilling prophecies of a Russian attack, because we showed that we could be divided. We showed that in the end we are scared. Russia has conquered Ukraine. It has achieved its goals. Bloody, long, needed a long time, but still it was ultimately successful. The Russian political system, society has radicalized. I think this is what Europeans underestimate. This war has radicalized spheres of society and business that were not radicalized and mobilized for the kind of anti-Western fight before. Just look at the economy, look at the financial institutions. They were predominantly liberal, under quotation marks, of course. but for networking, engagement, integration of Russia in international structures. Now they're talking just about China and Russia, and they're basically online with on the line of the Kremlin. Society is radicalized, security apparatus as well, and you should not underestimate that now Russia, by mobilizing people, by sending mobilized personnel through the war, it has indicted large parts, large swath, not only of the professional security apparatus, FSB, Rosgadia, and army, but really ordinary people into a genocidal war. And if they win and run an occupation regime, they will basically make them co-perpetrators of a genocide. And people look at German history. People who have done that usually rationalize what they've done. They don't say, sorry, that was a mistake, I'm guilty, I'm an asshole. They say, well, but we were under attack, wasn't everybody a great power? Even they know it's a lie, even they know it's a complete lie, it's a convenient lie, so you parrot it. And that's the unfortunate truth, that this war, also by pushing opposition into exile, has stabilized Putin's regime. Has stabilized the foreign policy course he thinks is good for the country, or is his, or good for him. It has increased the acceptance of that. And you see that in all polls, and if you don't believe some, Levada will tell you the same. And this is not propaganda. There is a radicalization in society. So the country there's no way of going back to to the 90s and, just Putin die and then everything will be back to normal. Too much has happened, too much has shifted. There is no normal to go back to. That's the unfortunate truth. So it's not only important how this war ends, and that this war ends with the Russian defeat, in order to break this vicious cycle and make the perpetrators not only perpetrators, but ultimately losers. That's a different perspective, especially in Russian society, whether you're a successful perpetrator or a loser. But also for European security. And the second thing is, we need to gun up beyond this war, because we are now in a new strategic defense reality, one way or the other. If Ukraine wins, we are in one where we have good preconditions for the next Cold War. If Ukraine loses, we're in a pretty bad situation for the next Cold War. But the next Cold War is already there. Edward Lucas wrote that in 2008, and he was spot on. And as much as a lot of people tried to ridicule that and try to find escape path and cheap escape path from the logic of the Cold War, there are none. This is reality now.
Indeed, 2 years after the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and 10 years after the start of the Russia's war against Ukraine, after the occupation of Crimea and later Donbass, parts of Donbass, we are still facing years of war in front of us, and we don't know what will be the outcome, and if the West, the democratic world, will be decisive enough to fight Russia's back. And while we are discussing this, the Ukrainian soldiers are protecting not only Ukraine, but Europe and the free world, and therefore we owe them our support as much as we can, not as long as it takes. It was Gustav Gressel, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, focusing on the topics of defense and security in Central Europe. Thank you so much for this interview, and don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. Wait for the next interviews. Thank you so much, Gustav Gressel.
Thank you very much.